2020. I'm lost. Welcome everyone to yet another exciting episode of our podcast, Driving Eco-Sustainability, My Perspective. And once again, I am your host, Grace. And today, once again, we are going to be talking about those key terms within the climate change space that challenge you. And as we started last time, we started with the key international agreements within this space that can help you navigate the space that you always hear people keep on referencing. And today, we are going to be talking about the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is a birth and as a result of the UNFCCC, United Nations Convention Framework on Climate Change. As I mentioned, one of the successes of the UNFCCC was this protocol. Now, basically, what is this protocol? As I mentioned, this is also an international treaty that was adopted to further implement the 1992 UNFCCC, where countries committed to reduce their greenhouse gas emission to pre-industrial levels. When and where was it adopted? Of course, in Kyoto, in Japan, in December 1997, and it entered into force on the 16th day of February 2005. Why was this protocol entered and why was it implemented? Of course, we can notice that it took a while. While it was adopted in 1997, it entered into force in 2005. And I will further share more information on why it took a while for it to enter into force. Now, why was this protocol adopted and later implemented? Now, as we earlier highlighted, the main objective of the UNFCCC was to reduce human-emitted greenhouse gases, mainly arising from dangerous human activities that interfere with the climate system. And as I earlier mentioned, these ranged from deforestation, use of fossil fuels, poor waste management and dumping, dangerous land uses that result into loss of biodiversity, like wetland encroachment, to mention but a few, especially people who encroach on wetlands, to start cultivation, or people who establish businesses within wetlands. So how was the protocol expected to achieve this? The protocol further buttressed the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities in the UNFCCC. Now, if you haven't yet watched our earlier episode, the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities is a principle that goes on to say that for parties to fulfill their commitment towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, they have common but differentiated responsibility. Therefore, different countries are recognized to have different capabilities and responsibilities to address climate change. Developed and industrialized countries are obliged to provide financial and technical and technological support to developing countries to respond to the negative effects of climate change. Annex 1 parties to the UNFCCC that ratified the protocol, as I earlier highlighted, the Annex 1 parties as the industrialized and developed countries that I mentioned, like the United Kingdom, the USA, Germany, Netherlands, Portugal, basically majority of the countries that are within the EU. They committed themselves to limit and reduce greenhouse gases arising from specific sectors that were highlighted in Annex A to the protocol during their first commitment period. And the overall and the bigger picture, it was to reduce these greenhouse gases to a respective quantified, highlighted emission levels in Annex B to the protocol. The overall plan was that we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 5% below the 1990 levels. Now, the first commitment period lasted from 2008 to 2009. And examples of activities and sectors where greenhouse gases were leading and they were expected to be reduced. Other greenhouse gases that were expected to be reduced were carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, nitrous oxide. And these ones mainly would say come from use of fossil fuels. And the leading sectors that emit these greenhouse gases that were highlighted in Annex B were energy and energy industries, transport, construction, agriculture, oil and gas, natural gas, waste and minerals production. Now, Annex 1 countries to the UNFCCC with specific binding reduction commitments under the protocol were 37 in number. And these ones cover the industrialized countries and economies in transition. They also include EU countries. These would meet their obligations, one, by maintaining a national inventory and registries to estimate the human-induced greenhouse gas emissions and the removal initiatives through creation of carbon sinks and reservoirs, like planting trees and revitalizing our wetlands and our oceans. Now the countries that were not in Annex 1 of the UNFCCC, these are the least developed countries. These countries were expected to participate in mitigating climate change through partnerships with the developed countries. Those are Annex 1 countries to the UNFCCC. And how was this going to be done? The protocol introduced ways through which countries can cooperate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with their commitments. And one of those ways was the Clean Development Mechanism. Now, under this mechanism, developed countries were expected to fund emission reduction projects in developing countries and earn credits. Now, as I earlier mentioned, this is how the non-Annex 1 parties that are mostly LDCs were expected to participate in emission reductions under the protocol. Next is the joint implementation, or as commonly known, JI. Here, developed countries would invest in emission reduction projects in other developed countries. The third one is emission trading. Here, countries buy and sell emission credits to meet their targets. The mechanisms and commitments were based on the principle that developed countries were the leading emitters of greenhouse gases, and developing nations whose emissions were still low, but they were also on the way to development. However, later, because of the tension arising from the fact that the developed countries felt cheated by the fact that the developing nations did not have obligations and they were only expected to benefit from this whole arrangement, the protocol was amended after the first commitment period, which came to be known as the Doha Amendment, which was not really well received because only 11% of the annual global emissions were covered by it. Now, notable nations and countries that protested and even refused to participate in the second commitment period included Japan, USA, Russia, Canada. They actually opposed the binding commitment targets that focused only on developing countries and indicated that they would not sign up, and they indeed did not sign up the second commitment period. And the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol was in fact adopted at COP18, which extended the protocol to 2020. They agreed that 2015 would be the year for the development of a successor document to be implemented from 2020 onwards, which later gave birth to the Paris Agreement of 2015. Now you are wondering, as I have highlighted earlier, you can tell that the Kyoto Protocol was not so popular. In fact, it was criticized. And what are those criticisms? The protocol has been criticized for being a backing dog that seldom beat, because it seemed to have been ineffective in curbing greenhouse gas emissions as anticipated. In fact, emissions were still on the rise and had risen by 40% between 1990 and 2009, at least according to the Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency report that was published in January 2010, and 4 years after the protocol entered into force. Can you imagine? The developed countries were also uncomfortable with the lack of quantitative emission reduction commitments for developing economies. Also, The emission reduction mechanisms like the CDM that I earlier highlighted were criticized for their inability during the implementation phase to also protect the interests of the local communities in developing nations, because as I earlier highlighted, CDM involved a developing country implementing a carbon reduction project in a developing nation and thereafter getting credits out of it. And emission trading, which permitted countries to host polluters and to buy from other countries the results of their environmental protection and unique nature, was also criticized because it looked like countries were literally hosting polluters. Yet it was the entire essence of the protocol, which was to stop pollution. And of course, in the grander scheme of things, stopping pollution meant curbing climate change. And of course, without making it seem like the protocol had no success at all anyway, at least the success out of all this was that the protocol was credited for establishing the carbon market trading through its 3 emission reduction mechanisms. That's emission trading, ET, the clean development mechanism, that's the CDM, and the JI, or joint implementation, that I have earlier talked about. And also the protocol had unique provisions on land use and land use change and forestry conservation. Therefore, these were also some of the ways that were going to be implemented for countries to enhance their green sinks and green reservoirs through planting trees. This is one way of improving land use and improving forestry conservation. And also the protocol is credited for being the birth of the Paris Agreement of 2015, which is widely known to be the successor to the protocol, which has been widely acclaimed and also positively received by nations worldwide compared to the Kyoto Protocol. Now, currently, the protocol is endorsed by 192 countries, and in as much as it has effectively been replaced by the Paris Agreement, its significance towards legislative development of international climate policy cannot be downplayed. And to date, several countries actually still implement the carbon trading mechanisms introduced by the protocol. So are you still wondering how you can utilize the protocol and how it can assist you to undertake or intensify climate action? You can participate in the in the carbon trading system or the carbon trading market as a project implementer or provider of the carbon credits. Also, you can undertake and participate in forestry, land conservation through planting trees to conserve and restore our nature and its rich biodiversity in the community. To learn the latest developments on the Kyoto Protocol, you can visit the official website of the UNFCCC, which I have added to the description of this episode so that you can learn more. And if you're interested in learning more about the international climate change policy, listen in, subscribe, share your views. Are you interested in that climate change term that has challenged you? You can share it in our comments so that we can explain it further to simplify it. I hope you have enjoyed and you have picked a thing or two about the Kyoto Protocol going forward. Thank you so much. I was your host, Grace.